September 1926. The night air in Cicero, Illinois, is pierced by a barrage of gunfire outside the Southside Gang headquarters. Machine guns thunder, and the Hawthorne Inn is pummeled with 1,000 bullets, all targeting the infamous gangster Al Capone. Yet, remarkably, Capone escapes once again. Whether it's luck, tight security, or inside information, Capone appears invincible, at least for now. Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known as Al Capone, was born on January 17, 1899 in Brooklyn, New York. His father, Gabriel Capone, was a barber who emigrated from Angri, a small village near Naples in southern Italy. Gabriel, along with his wife Teresa Raiola, a seamstress, arrived in Brooklyn in 1893. Their first home was at 95 Navy Street in the Navy Yard area of downtown Brooklyn, later moving to Park Slope when Alphonse was 11. Al Capone had 8 siblings. Vincenzo, who later became a prohibition agent under the name Richard Hart; Raphael James, known as Bottles, who controlled Al's liquor empire; Salvatore, known as Frank, who worked alongside Al; and siblings Ermina, who died young; Ermino, known as John; Albert, Matthew, and Mafalda. As a student, Alphonse showed promise and brought home excellent results, but struggled with the strict rules of his Catholic upbringing. At age 14, he was expelled for striking a female teacher, ending his formal education but marking the beginning of his education in the criminal world, deeply influenced by the environment in Brooklyn. Unsurprisingly, Al transitioned to gang life, joining the Bowery Boys and Junior 40 Thieves, and later the Brooklyn Rippers and the 5 Points Gang, the most powerful gang of the time based in Lower Manhattan. By 1917, Al was working for Frankie Yale, a bootlegger and protection racketeer. Yale demanded payments from local businesses to ensure their protection, or rather, to avoid harm from Yale's enforcers. With funds from this operation, Yale opened the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, where Al worked as a bartender and doorman, absorbing insights and knowledge about the criminal world. Influential figures like gangster Johnny Torrio also mentored him during this time. It was at the Harvard Inn that Al earned the nickname he despised, Scarface. He got into a fight with local gangster Frankie Galluccio after offending Galluccio's sister Lena with an ill-judged compliment. In the ensuing drunken brawl, Galluccio slashed Capone's face, leaving a lifelong scar. Self-conscious about this mark, Capone often posed for photographs from his unscarred side and fabricated stories about it being a war wound from a German gunner in World War I, a claim entirely false, as he never served in the war. Despite this, his preferred nickname among friends was Snorky, a term for a sharp dresser. He falsely claimed it was a war wound from a German gunner in the trenches of World War I, even though he never served in the war. His preferred nickname among friends, however, was Snorky, a term for a sharp dresser. He was also known as Big Al, Big Boy, and public enemy number 1. After the incident with Frankie Galluccio, Capone wanted revenge, but was forced to reconcile by higher-ranking gangsters. Galluccio apologized, and Capone promised not to seek retribution, a promise he kept even as a mob boss. Capone recognized that Galluccio was merely protecting his family, respecting a code of loyalty and family that was integral to gangland operations. Family was everything to many Italian-American gangsters. When Alabama's girlfriend, May Josephine Coughlin, gave birth to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone, in December 1918, they married a few weeks later on December 30th. May had worked in a local department store when she met Al. He was 19 and she was 21. Because he was underage, he had to obtain written consent from his parents to marry. Their marriage remained happy until the end. Shortly after their wedding, Johnny Torrio invited Al to move to Chicago, and Al agreed, looking to start anew in the Windy City. In 1919, Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago and began working as a bouncer in a brothel where he contracted syphilis. With hindsight, treatment with a newly introduced drug called Salvarsan could likely have cured him, but Al never sought treatment until it was too late. The notorious surge in organized crime in the 1920s was largely due to the continued demand for alcohol, despite its sale and consumption being illegal under the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, ratified in January 1919. The push for banning alcohol had been growing since the 1800s, especially among puritanical Protestant Christians. These campaigns became increasingly vocal and forceful, led by ardent temperance supporters like Carrie Nation, who famously embarked on a violent rampage across Kansas in 1900, smashing bars and saloons with rocks and hatchets, claiming divine inspiration. Despite militant anti-alcohol campaigns, many people, particularly those of Italian and Irish heritage, had no intention of abstaining. This led to a massive black market for alcohol, which the underworld capitalized on, making fortunes by defying prohibition. Despite the efforts of militant anti-alcohol campaigners, many of whom were women who had suffered from drunken husbands, the push for prohibition grew stronger. By the early 1920s, 46 states, pressured by politicians and officials, eventually passed the 18th Amendment. This made the sale and consumption of most alcoholic beverages illegal in America. Nonetheless, many, especially those of Italian and Irish descent, continued to drink. Consequently, a massive black market emerged, allowing the underworld to profit immensely from the illegal liquor trade. Meanwhile, life for the Capone family in Chicago was thriving. In 1923, Al Capone bought a house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Park Manor for $5,500, posing as a boxing promoter. In reality, he was working for Johnny Torrio, who had taken over from Chicago crime boss Big Jim Colosimo. At the height of Prohibition, the Chicago outfit, or South Side Gang, operated illegal stills, breweries, and a transport network reaching Canada, protected by bribed politicians and law enforcement. Businesses that refused to buy their illicit liquor were often bombed, resulting in around 100 deaths during the 1920s. Capone enjoyed the high life, donning expensive suits, smoking cigars, and eating gourmet food. He was also known for his flashy jewelry and fondness for female company. Capone reveled in public attention, cheered at ball games, and viewed himself as a modern-day Robin Hood, making charitable donations from his illicit wealth. When questioned about his lifestyle, he would humbly claim to be just a businessman satisfying public demand. By 1923, political reform in Chicago led Capone and Torrio to move their operations to Cicero, Illinois, to avoid interference and investigation under the new mayor, William Emmett M. Dever. In Cicero, Capone expanded the gang's operations, setting up brothels, speakeasies, and gambling dens. They controlled the town's liquor supply, using bribery and intimidation to influence local elections, including the 1924 Cicero municipal elections. The corrupt Republican mayor, Joseph Z. Clanner, with his bipartisan administration, faced little opposition, thanks to the Southside Gang's influence, aided by Capone's brother Frank. In 1924, the Democratic Party decided to challenge the status quo, threatening to clean up the town. Clanner, needing help to secure his win, offered the Chicago outfit immunity from prosecution in Cicero. Capone, bringing in 200 men from his gang and allied gangs, initiated a campaign of violence and intimidation to ensure Clanner's election victory. This contingent, including his brothers Frank and Ralph and cousin Charles Fischetti, used stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and general intimidation to dominate the election. In Cicero, Capone and his cronies were eager to intervene. They brought in 200 men, including members of Capone's gang and allied gangs. This group included Capone's brothers, Frank and Ralph, as well as his cousin, Charles Fischetti. The gang launched a campaign of stabbings, shootings, kidnappings, and general intimidation to ensure Clanner's re-election as mayor. The terror began on May 31st, the eve of the election. The Democratic nominee for town clerk, William K. Plumham, was beaten and his office ransacked. His wife was also assaulted. On April 1st, Election Day, voters faced submachine guns and sawed-off shotguns at the polling booths, forcing them to vote for Clanner multiple times if necessary. Those who resisted were prevented from voting or beaten. Cars filled with gunmen roamed the streets, targeting individuals like Democrat Rudolph Hurt, whose campaign headquarters were sprayed with gunfire. The city clerk challenger was pistol whipped in front of his family and supporters. Frank Capone himself beat up campaign officials and ransacked another opponent's headquarters. Polling stations were raided and ballots were snatched from voters' hands. Voters were shot, stabbed, or beaten by gangsters. Joseph Price, a campaign official, was tied up, gagged, and battered. Democratic official Stanley Stankiewicz was taken to a Chicago basement, blindfolded, and held until after the polling stations closed. Up to 20 others were chained in a basement to prevent them from voting. But a police officer was beaten after being disarmed. Michael Gavin, a Democratic campaigner, was shot in both legs and kept in a basement with 8 other campaign workers. Late that afternoon, Cook County Judge Edmund K. Cherokee sent 70 Chicago police officers to Cicero to quell the chaos. Among them were 5 squads of detectives and 9 squads of uniformed police. They spotted Al Capone, his brother Frank, henchman Dave Headland, and Charles Fischetti. A gun battle ensued, resulting in the death of Frank Capone and the wounding of Headland. Al Capone and Fischetti escaped, though Fischetti later surrendered. Frank Capone's funeral was lavish, costing $20,000 for flowers provided by local bootlegger and florist Dino Banyan. Mourners wailed for the young man, while the same police officers who had killed him observed from a distance, possibly to gauge the mob boss's reaction. But it didn't happen, at least not at the funeral. As boss of the mob in Cicero, Capone faced many assassination attempts from rival gang members and the constant threat of arrest. His bribery and corruption of local politicians provided some protection, but he and his entourage were still vulnerable, so Capone remained highly security conscious. In the early 20s, Capone's driver was found tortured and murdered, and Jamie Weiss narrowly escaped an assassination attempt in the Chicago Loop, the city's business district. Capone's friend Johnny Torrio had taken over from Jim Colosimo after Colosimo was killed on May 11, 1920. Many believed Capone was involved in this murder. In his new role, Capone used his New York street smarts to negotiate gang war disagreements and broker treaties, earning a reputation as an arbitrator. One notable deal was over territory control between the North Side Gang and the Jenner brothers, who were allied with Torrio and led by Dean O'Banion. The Jenner brothers started selling cheap booze to O'Banion's customers. Torrio appeared to ignore this, and some believe he sanctioned or arranged O'Banion's murder on November 10, 1924, at O'Banion's flower shop. Brooklyn crime boss Frankie Yale and Jenner gunman Albert Anselmi and John Scalise shot O'Banion while he was clipping chrysanthemums. O'Banion was known for his bizarre behavior, wide grin, and backslapping anyone he met. He drew unwanted attention by gunning down a man in public and killing another at Al's club, the Four Deuces. He sealed his fate by tricking Torrio into being present at his brewery during a raid, which led to Torrio's arrest. With O'Banion dead, Jamie Weiss took over the North Side Gang with Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran, seeking revenge. A 5-year gang war ensued. In January 1925, Capone was ambushed but escaped unharmed. 12 days later, Torrio was shot after a shopping trip. Shaken, Torrio resigned, handing control of the Chicago outfit to Capone at age 26. On September 20, 1926, the North Side Gang attacked Capone's Hawthorne Inn headquarters with over 1,000 submachine gun shots, but Capone was unharmed and called for a truce. Negotiations followed but achieved nothing. 3 weeks later, Jamie Weiss was killed by the South Side Gang outside O'Hanion's flower shop, now the North Side headquarters. In January 1927, the owner of Hawthorne's restaurant, a friend of Capone's, was killed in retaliation by Bugs Moran and Drucci. This ongoing turf war prompted Capone to increase his security, often leaving Chicago. His entourage would hire entire Pullman sleeper cars for trips to places like Little Rock, Hot Springs, Omaha, or Cleveland, booking hotels under false names for safety. In 1928, Capone purchased a 14-room mansion on Palm Island in Biscayne Bay, Miami, for $40,000 from beer magnate August Busch. The property wasn't registered in Capone's name, and he had no bank account, using Western Union for cash deliveries instead. Despite his criminal activities, Capone was a prolific contributor to charity and set up a soup kitchen in Chicago during the Depression, boosting his popularity. Capone leveraged political alliances, notably supporting William Hale Thompson with a $250,000 donation in the 1927 Chicago mayoral election. Thompson's campaign hinted at reopening illegal drinking saloons, which would benefit Capone's bootlegging business. After this, Thompson defeated his reformist rival William Emmett Deaver and became mayor of Chicago in 1927. Capone continued to support Thompson, ensuring their mutually beneficial relationship persisted until 1929. However, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre would soon shatter Capone's thin veneer of legitimacy and jeopardize the informal immunity from prosecution he enjoyed through his alliance with Thompson. Bugs Moran. Now the leader of the North Side Gang following Jamie Weiss's death remained a thorn in Capone's side. The animosity between them was fierce, fueled by competition over bootlegging operations and Moran's disapproval of Capone's involvement in prostitution, which clashed with his Catholic principles. The ongoing tit-for-tat killings culminated on the morning of Thursday, February 14, 1929, the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone devised a plan against Moran by renting an apartment across from Moran's headquarters to monitor his men. On February 13th, Capone arranged for a phone call to Moran, informing him of a whiskey delivery from Detroit at a bargain price the next morning at 10:30 a.m. at the SMC Cartage Company on North Clark Street, where Moran's bootlegging vehicles were kept. When the truck arrived, Capone orchestrated a fake police raid with 2 gunmen in plain clothes and 2 dressed as Chicago police officers. They lined up 7 of Moran's men against a wall, ostensibly to search them. At a given signal, the gunmen mowed them down with machine guns and shotguns. Bugs Moran escaped the attack, having overslept that morning, even though he was the primary target. The massacre's fallout was disastrous for Capone. Photos of the slain victims led to a public outcry, damaging Capone's image and earning him the new nickname Public Enemy No. 1. Questions about his close ties with Mayor Thompson and the appropriateness of their relationship arose. Emergency services were delayed due to neighbors assuming the police were already on the scene because of the fake officers. By the time real police arrived, 6 men were dead. The lone survivor, Frank Gusenberg, was taken to the hospital but refused to identify his attackers, adhering to the gangster code before he died. Bugs Moran broke the code, informing the police that Capone orchestrated the attack. Capone was summoned to court, but he denied responsibility and claimed illness to avoid appearing, twice succeeding in having the charges dropped. Al Capone was reputed for delegating his dirty work, yet one story suggests otherwise. According to this tale, Capone hosted a dinner for several of his men, including Scalise, Anselmi, and Junta, men he believed were conspiring against him. The story claims Capone personally beat them with a baseball bat before ordering their execution. Though some historians question its veracity, one associate claimed to have witnessed the event. Efforts to bring Capone to justice intensified in 1929. On March 27th, FBI agents arrested Capone as he left a courtroom after testifying to a grand jury investigating prohibition violations. The charge was feigning illness to avoid earlier prosecution. On May 16th, Capone was arrested again in Philadelphia for carrying a concealed weapon, resulting in a 1-year prison sentence. On August 8th, Capone was sent to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia and released in March 1930. In April 1930, Capone faced arrest again on vagrancy charges in Miami Beach, where the governor ordered his expulsion from the state. During his arrest, Capone alleged that the police had threatened his family and denied him food and water. Capone was subsequently charged with perjury for his claims, leading to a 3-day trial in July where he was found not guilty. However, in September, a judge issued another warrant for Capone's arrest on vagrancy charges. This judge then leveraged the publicity from the Capone case to challenge Thompson in the Republican primary election, using the spotlight to gain votes. In February 1931, Capone faced another trial, this time for contempt of court due to his claims of illness. Judge James Herbert Wilkerson scrutinized the testimony of Capone's doctor, aiding the prosecution. As a result, Capone was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but remained free pending appeal. Law enforcement was desperate to bring Capone to justice, and Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrand devised a new strategy. But she realized that the gangsters' lavish lifestyles required significant income, yet they never filed income tax returns. Willebrand proposed prosecuting gangsters for tax evasion, which wouldn't require the challenging testimony needed for their other illegal activities. She tested this approach in the United States v.s. Manly Sullivan, an illegal bootlegger case. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., ruled that illegally earned income was subject to income tax, and the Fifth Amendment could not protect criminals from reporting it. Following this, the Internal Revenue Service appointed Frank J. Wilson to investigate Capone's taxes. Capone's lawyers were instructed to correct his tax records, declaring taxable income of $100,000 for 1928 and 1929. Since Capone hadn't paid taxes on this amount, the declaration itself was an admission of guilt. On March 13, 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion for 1924. Then, on June 5th, a federal grand jury indicted him on 22 counts of income tax evasion from 1925 to 1929. Capone was released on $50,000 bail. A week later, Eliot Ness and his team became involved in the legal process. Their evidence led to Capone's indictment on 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act, which detailed prohibition laws. Ness, an American prohibition agent in Chicago, led a team of incorruptible law enforcement officers known as the Untouchables. They were immune to the bribery and intimidation attempts of the Chicago outfit. Ness joined the U.S. Treasury Department in 1926 and worked within the Bureau of Prohibition in Chicago. His mission was to dismantle Capone's illegal bootlegging operations and gather evidence of conspiracy to violate the Volstead Act. Ness led raids on Capone's illegal stills and breweries, disrupting his supply chain and causing an estimated $9 million in losses. Much of their information was obtained through wiretaps. Ness's operation inflicted significant financial damage on Capone's empire and provided evidence for the 5,000 Volstead Act violations Capone would eventually face in court. On June 16, 1931, Al Capone stood before Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, the same judge who had convicted Capone's brother, Ralph, for tax evasion in 1930, sentencing him to 3 years in prison. This time, Al Capone pled guilty to income tax evasion and to 5,000 violations of the Volstead Act as part of a plea bargain. He agreed to a 2.5-year sentence. However, when it came to sentencing, Judge Wilkerson refused to honor the plea bargain. On July 30, 1931, Capone's counsel retracted the guilty pleas, arguing that a lawyer could not confess for his client and that the lawyers had admitted the income, not Capone. Judge Wilkerson overruled this objection, stating that any statement made to a government official was done at the person's own risk. He ruled that Capone's lawyer's letter to federal authorities admitting income could be used as evidence. Wilkerson decided to try Capone on the income tax evasion charges alone, prioritizing them over the Volstead Act charges. Capone's lawyers, caught off guard by this decision, had only hours to prepare for the trial. They argued that Capone's income was lost due to gambling, but their defense was weak. Gambling losses could only be deducted from gambling winnings, and Capone's expenses demonstrated that he had substantial funds available, far exceeding their claims. The court detailed Capone's spending extensively, revealing that he had evaded $215,000 in taxes on a gross income of $1,038,654 over 5 years. On October 31, 1931, Capone was convicted on 3 counts of income tax evasion. A week later, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, fined $50,000, and ordered to pay $7,692 in court costs. Additionally, he was liable for the $215,000 in back taxes plus interest. His sentence for contempt of court would be served concurrently. In response, Capone hired a team of tax expert lawyers from Washington who filed a writ of habeas corpus, requiring the detainee to be brought to court to determine if the detention was lawful. They argued based on a Supreme Court ruling that tax evasion was not fraud, suggesting that the prosecution's time limit for some of the tax years might have expired. However, the judge ruled that the time Capone had spent in Miami should be deducted from the age of the offenses, making the argument invalid and denying the appeal for both the conviction and the sentence. Following the failed appeal, Capone was sent to the Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary on May 3, 1932, at the age of 33. Eliot Ness, among the federal agents accompanying Capone from the Cook County Jail to the penitentiary, witnessed the only known meeting between the two men. Upon arrival, Capone, weighing 250 pounds, was diagnosed with syphilis, gonorrhea, and a perforated nasal septum due to excessive cocaine use. In addition, he was also suffering from withdrawal symptoms from cocaine, to which he was addicted. Whilst in Atlanta, Capone was competent in his job of stitching soles onto shoes, but he was not popular with fellow inmates who felt he was both a weak personality, unable to deal with the bullying the other inmates carried out, and also was receiving special treatment. This idea arose from the protection he was offered by his cellmate, Red Rudnensky, a seasoned criminal who was associated with the South Side gang. And so, with the hatred he was facing from other inmates, the incoherence of the letters he was writing home, as well as Red Rudnensky's concerns that he would have a breakdown, it was decided that Capone would be moved to the newly opened Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. His new address was to be Cell 181 in Alcatraz. On the 23rd June 1936, Capone was attacked in the laundry area by fellow inmate James Critterton Lucas, who was serving a life sentence for bank robbery. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors stolen from the prison barber, but Capone was only superficially wounded, and so he was able to throw Lucas against a wall in retaliation. After the attack, Lucas was sent into solitary confinement as a punishment. During his time at Alcatraz, Capone's syphilis worsened, affecting his mental faculties, until in February 1938, he was diagnosed formally with syphilis of the brain. And so the final year of his Alcatraz sentence was spent in the hospital ward of the prison, where he was both disorientated and confused. And so when he was released from Alcatraz on the 6th January 1939, he was immediately transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to fulfill his sentence for contempt of court. And as well as this, he was given parole on the 16th November 1939, when his wife May appealed to the court on the grounds of his reduced mental capacity. The effect of Capone's imprisonment was portrayed by those involved in it as reducing the operation of organized crime carried out by the South Side mob. But in reality, it only called for a temporary change of leader, who was found in Frank Nitti, at least when he was released from prison in March 1932, having served a sentence for tax evasion himself. In reality, the Chicago outfit continued their crime business at a more discreet level than when Capone had been in charge. They remained low profile, reducing the killings that had been a mark of Capone's time in charge, and this low profile continued once prohibition was abolished, as the gangsters who replaced Capone were wary of going the same way he had. The low profile meant that it was unclear to many who was actually in control of the organization and who was a mere figurehead or frontman. But organized crime continued with prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and labor union racketeering. Without serious investigations, and into the late 1950s, FBI agents discovered an outfit run by Capones, former men operating in the Chicago underworld. On November 16, 1939, Al Capone was released from prison due to his deteriorating health. Initially referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, he was refused admission because of his notorious reputation. Instead, he was admitted to Union Memorial Hospital for treatment of paresis, a condition caused by late-stage syphilis. As a token of gratitude, Capone donated 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to the hospital. Capone left Union Memorial on March 20, 1940, and returned to his home on Palm Island. He was fortunate to be one of the first patients in America treated with the newly released drug penicillin. Although it was too late to cure his condition or reverse the brain damage, the drug did help slow the disease's progression in his final years. In 1946, Capone was examined by a Baltimore psychiatrist and his own physician, who concluded that he had the mental age of a 12-year-old. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. Initially, he began to recover, but soon contracted bronchopneumonia. This led to a cardiac arrest on January 22nd, and on January 25, 1947, Al Capone died of heart failure caused by apoplexy. He passed away at his home, surrounded by loved ones. A private funeral was held in Chicago a week later, and Capone was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery. In 1950, his remains, along with those of his father Gabriel and brother Salvatore, were exhumed and reinterred at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. Despite his death, the Chicago outfit continued its extensive criminal activities, including loan sharking, gambling, prostitution, political corruption, extortion, and murder. Though not the only organized crime syndicate in Chicago, it was the most violent, organized, and powerful mob in the Midwest, with influence extending to Florida and California. Even after his death, Al Capone's legend lived on. His image and characterization became synonymous with the American gangster, shaping the perception of organized crime for later generations. He became an iconic figure, with his story enduring in films and publications to this day. What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a modern-day Robin Hood, providing the public with what they desired, or a ruthless killer whose penchant for the high life led to his downfall? Let us know in the comments section. This was the story of Al Capone. I hoped it helped you fall asleep in a peaceful and soothing way. Subscribe to the Sleep Hub channel for more sleep documentaries, and I'll catch you on the next one. Good night, and be safe.